Thank you, John. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As John introduced me, Denny McCoy is my name. I'm the CEO of Ibec, and for those of you who don't know Ibec, it's Ireland's largest business representative organisation and by far the largest lobbying organisation within the country. We're also a house of brands, as John indicated there, and the Buildings Materials Federation, BMF, very happily a part of CitA and supportive in the NBC space as well, and particularly as the roadmap. But in addition, we've got 43 sub-brands, so we range right across biopharma, medtech, retail, food, drink, small firms associations. So we get to see quite a fair bit of different types of sectors. And my own background is as an economist, so that when looking at the BIM and the productivity issues, it's probably through that prism of economics that I'm looking at it. And to be blunt, to anybody observing the construction sector, particularly over the last number of years, it's how far behind it appears to be in terms of the use of digitalization and efficiency techniques. So the impression that was left, particularly in the last boom, was of an incredibly inefficient sector, particularly when it came to productivity per employee. So that we'd observed that, yes, construction output was very dramatic during the so-called Celtic Tiger period, but when you looked at the employment growth, on average during some of those years, it was 12% employment growth and 8% output growth, and negative productivity. So that it seems to me from that kind of scaling that anything that brings the discipline of efficiency, the digitalization in terms of through that supply chain and getting delivery quicker, I think is hugely crucial. Because what you're identifying today, I believe, is both simultaneously effectiveness along with efficiency. So one of the features that we have in our economy right now, and the need for what you're talking about today, while you're dealing maybe in the micro, what you're doing is going to be very significant for the macroeconomics of Ireland. In that context, I want to make the distinction between effectiveness and efficiency, because there's an obsession with efficiency. But there's efficiency is a bit like in running. Efficiency is like pace. I can run 4-minute mile pace. Unfortunately, I can't run a mile at 4-minute mile pace. So telling you what pace I can do something presupposes that I can actually get the job done. Effectiveness is the first order issue. Efficiency is a second order issue. And yet we obsess about the efficiency piece on the basis that we've assumed that we've actually got the effectiveness. The effectiveness is where your productivity and where the digitalization comes in. Second order issue is going to be the cost of that delivery. So I'm not dissing the cost piece, but I'm just saying that there's two aspects to this. And too often it would appear, or at least the impression that's given, is that in the lack of having that digitalization through the production process, it gives rise to a whole host of inefficiencies and productivity problems of redesign, rebuild, and so on. So that's why the roadmap, I think, transcends much more dramatically than just your sector, because right now in the economy, as you know, there's a really big demand for construction, not just residential housing, but all of the public infrastructure, the commercial buildings, etc. So in the last couple of minutes, maybe that I might just share some insights around the economy to give you some of the context on where your work today and specifics of what you're doing. When you're down in that very much in the micro, I just want to give you a sense of that macro and make the bridge between what you're talking about in terms of productivity, efficiency, and effectiveness, and how that's needed right now in the economy. First of all, I'm 30 years as an economist. I've never seen an economy, never mind the Irish economy, in a position that the Irish economy is in right now. Ireland is a frontier resource economy, and that knowledge is hugely misunderstood, because how you deal with such an economy is fundamentally different than the regular economic cycles. Of course, there's economic cycles underneath here, but the underlying trend in the economy, in my view, is a resource. So it's the equivalent of having an oil find. And if you don't believe me, what do I mean by frontier? What do I mean by resource? Well, first of all, 10 years ago, if you looked at the Forbes top 10 companies, you'd see 4 oil and gas companies in the top 10. There is none, maybe there's one, but there's none effectively there now. General Electric would have been in that top 10 as well. It's not even in the Dow Jones index anymore. And so what you've had is very tangible companies replaced now by what are believed to be intangible. So a lot of the value added is in this intangibility. So you're looking at the Facebooks, Amazon, Apples, etc., who have very little physical assets, where all of the value is in the intangible parts of their balance sheet. But even tangible companies are now increasingly driven by intangible assets. So if you look at Glanbia, a very classic dairy co-op business, now moved into infant formula and increasingly into sports nutrition. In fact, one of the world's leading sport nutritional companies. So coming from the grass, extracting the nutrients, getting rid of the liquid, and suddenly they have a product that, yes, is tangible, but the value in their balance sheet is embedded in the value of their intellectual property, their brands, and so on, what you're talking about today in terms of that knowledge as embedded in the intellectual property that is digitalization. So Glanbia would have had a balance sheet value of intangible assets in 2000, the year 2000, of approximately €1 million. 1 million. Today, the value of their balance sheet on intangible assets is €1.3 billion. What I want to get across here is this is the new frontier, where you're moving from tangible to intangible, to the intellectual property to which you're discussing today on the intellectual property that's being brought through the BIM into the construction sector. That's the frontier piece. Ireland's a frontier economy because it's capturing so much of this intellectual, intangible balance sheets into our economy in the last number of years. And the question is, how did it land here? Well, the interests have very little time, just to give you a taste for it. This is the alignment in corporate taxation with this idea of substance because of the work of the OECD. And so in the year 2015, where there's been a lot of controversy in the Irish economy about the numbers, is the balance sheets in Ireland increased, corporate balance sheets in Ireland increased by 40%, 40% in a single year. Now, lots of people believe there was no balance sheets of any significance in 2014, so 40% of very little will be very little. However, Ireland's had a build-up over 50 years of significant corporate balance sheets, CRH, Ryanair, Kerry, Glanbia, Primark, and also companies like Accenture have become an Irish company, Ingersoll Rand, in advance of 2015. But in the year 2015, the corporate balance sheet increased by 40%. Companies like Medtronic, aircraft leasing companies like GPA, which are now called AirCap, moved their balance sheets back in here. And you say, so what? This is all funny money. Well, it's not. Because what happened from that balance sheet was a P&L extraction of about 60 billion, which, yes, drove our GDP numbers up by 1/3 in a single year. But the consequence of that is it's also been generative of huge resources. So, for instance, in 2015, just to give you a sense and to finish up to keep John on time, is that in 15, that resource that was surged into our economy from this oil find that is intellectual property, because it's the new gold or oil of the modern world, which is intellectual property embedded in corporate balance sheets, gave rise to corporate tax revenue of significant proportion. And just here's a thought experiment for you early in the morning. The Department of Finance were expecting to get about 4.3 billion of corporate tax revenue in 15. That was in November they made that prediction. 6 weeks later, when the money came in on the 31st of December, instead of 4.3 billion, they'd received 6.9 billion. 2.6 billion off a change. That's the end of the pipe. If the corporate tax rate 12.5% or effectively more like 10, they'd missed 26 billion of profits embedded in the economy's balance sheets. In other words, Ryanair were producing €1 billion of profit in 2015. There was 26 Ryanairs that the government had failed to observe in its balance sheets. By any imagination, that's an oil find in modern equivalent. And that has increased since. Consequence for your industry and the overlay is Ireland is awash with cash. Absolutely awash with cash in a way that is gargantuan in relative proportions to what normal economies can do. And the last piece, because no good turn goes unpunished, I couldn't leave it on an upbeat. Consequence is that is surging through our labour market right now. And so we're experiencing the biggest loss of competitiveness that exceeds anything that went through the Celtic Tiger. Wage rates are going up dramatically, and productivity in terms of time committed is being withdrawn. Lots of people are taking more leave, more sabbatical, because the consequence of when wages go up, you expect people to offer more hours work, give up leisure. The problem is that if you put up the wages, the hours they've already have been working are now more valuable, and they have to make a decision, do they have enough money, in inverted commas, from the wage increase, and so what they want is more time back. We watch those lifestyle changes as well. Lots of people are moving, looking for 4-day weeks because they want to concentrate on their lifestyle issues, be that whatever they want to do, become triathletes or whatever. Great if it keeps going. But it's a misread of how this economy has surged in the last number of years and how we got there. That's going to have huge consequences for all of your businesses. And I'm certain you're already observing that. The demand for much higher wages, flexibility around time, and the withdrawal. That's a productivity withdrawal. All the more reason why, when people are at work, keep this in the positive, that you get that maximum amount of productivity in the time they will be committing relative to those efficiencies. John, at that point, I might leave that as a kind of a macro point for the micro work you're doing today. Thank you.